Hi, this is Alex from devstories.eu. Terraform Fundamentals, Episode 5 of 13. If a database must exist before a web server can connect to it, how does an infrastructure tool know which to build first without sequential scripts? If you are coming from an imperative scripting background like Bash or Python, you might look for ways to enforce execution line by line. But in Terraform, the order of the lines in your file does not matter at all. The only thing that matters is resource relationships and dependencies. Terraform is a highly intelligent execution engine. Before it creates anything, it analyzes your configuration and builds a directed acyclic graph. This graph maps out exactly how every piece of infrastructure connects to the others. It uses this map to determine the most efficient creation order, building unrelated resources in parallel and sequencing the ones that rely on each other. You never write manual wait or sleep scripts. Most of the time, Terraform figures out this sequencing automatically through implicit dependencies. An implicit dependency happens when one resource references an attribute of another resource. Consider a scenario where you're creating an Azure virtual network and a subnet. A subnet cannot exist without a virtual network. In your configuration, you define the virtual network block, and then you define the subnet block. Inside the subnet block, you set the virtual network name argument to point directly at the name attribute of the virtual network resource you just defined. When Terraform parses this, it sees the connection. It inherently knows it must finish creating the virtual network and fetch its generated name before it can even start creating the subnet. You do not have to tell it what to do. You just pass the data and Terraform handles the timing. This is the part that matters. Always use implicit dependencies if you can. By referencing attributes directly, you give Terraform the exact information it needs to optimize your deployments safely. Sometimes the relationship between two resources is not visible in the code. You might have a situation where a resource requires another resource to be fully active, but it does not actually need to pull any data from it. Consider deploying a virtual machine that runs an application while also provisioning a managed database. The application needs the database to finish booting before it can start operating. However, the virtual machine configuration does not reference any attributes from the database resource. Because there is no data link, Terraform assumes these two resources are entirely unrelated and will try to build them at the same time. The application will boot, look for a database that doesn't exist yet, and fail. To fix this, you use explicit dependencies. Terraform provides a meta-argument called depends on. You add this argument to the virtual machine block and pass it a list containing the database resource. This explicitly tells Terraform to pause the creation of the virtual machine until the database is completely finished provisioning. You should treat explicit dependencies as a last resort. They force Terraform to be more conservative in its execution, which slows down your deployments. They can also make your configuration harder to maintain over time, as the actual reason for the dependency is not always obvious to the next engineer reading the file. Letting the execution graph do the heavy lifting is what separates declarative infrastructure from procedural scripts, so stop trying to micromanage the execution order and let the data flow dictate the sequence. Thanks for spending a few minutes with me. Until next time, take it easy.